Please help me!
The crack of Derek's polished leather Oxfords against Amina's ribs echoed like a gunshot through the Lotte luxury mall. Amina collapsed, her professional black and white shirt snagging on a glass perfume counter as she hit the floor. The low bun she'd neatly pinned that morning unraveled, dark strands of hair splaying across the cold, white marble. For a heartbeat, the air in the atrium seemed to freeze. Amina looked up, her breath hitching in a mask of genuine shock and fear at the man looming over her with cold, detached arrogance. Derek Collins, tall, athletic, and encased in a tailored black slim-fit suit that screamed corporate muscle, looked down at her as if she were a stain on the floor. "Stay down in the gutter where you belong, Amina," Derek sneered, his groomed beard twitching with contempt. "You always were a bottom feeder." Derek had no idea. He was still looking at the poor ex who had once recoiled in a car with nothing but a prayer, the woman he had abandoned while she was carrying a child he didn't want, the woman who had watched her world crumble into ash. He didn't see the woman who had risen from those ruins. Underneath her professional trousers, the tops of a heavy gold signet ring, a dragon's crest, was tucked safely in her pocket. He didn't know about the armored motorcade idling in the VIP garage with a rugged, charcoal-suited man she had shared a breakfast of silk and steel with just hours ago. Derek thought he was the enforcer, the corporate muscle with professional precision. He had no idea that in exactly 5 minutes, the shadow of soul, Kang Min-jae, a man whose stillness was more terrifying than any shout, would walk through those doors. Derek Collins had just delivered a calculated act of violence to the only thing in this world Min-jae valued more than his throne. And Derek was about to find out that while he played at being muscle, he had just invited a monster to his doorstep. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gangnam penthouse acted as a silent witness to a transition of power every morning. As the sun crawled over the jagged Seoul skyline, Amina stood by the glass, her reflection ghosting over the high-rises. In this light, she was no longer the woman who had spent nights huddled in a rusted sedan, counting pennies for a loaf of bread. She was wrapped in silk the color of midnight, the weight of a heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, a constant reminder that the world could no longer touch her without permission. A heavy, familiar warmth settled against her back. Kang Min-jae didn't move like a man who owned half the city's shadows. He moved like the tide, inevitable and rhythmic. His large, calloused hands slid around her waist, the stark contrast of his skin against her deep complexion, a visual vow of protection. Even through his thin silk robe, she could feel the heat radiating from the intricate irasumi tattoos that mapped his history. Tigers prowled across his shoulders, their ink claws disappearing beneath his collar, while lotus flowers bloomed over his ribs, marking the places where he had survived the blades of his enemies. "You're thinking about the past again," Min-jae murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in her chest. He turned her slowly in his arms, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, with a reverence that felt almost sacred. In the underworld, this man was a monolith of stone and ice, a king who decided fates with a weary nod of his head. But here, in the sanctuary they had built on the 34th floor, he was the man who noticed the slight tremor in her hands when the wind blew too hard against the glass. Amina looked up into his rugged face. A faint scar bisected his left eyebrow, a jagged souvenir from a life she only saw in the headlines, yet his dark eyes held nothing but a terrifying, absolute devotion. "Sometimes I wake up and expect the floor to be cold. I expect to find my bank account empty and the door locked from the outside." Min-jae's jaw tightened, the only sign of the dormant beast beneath the surface. He reached out, his heavy gold signet ring catching the morning light as he tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. "The door's only locked to keep the world out, Amina, never to keep you in." He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. "I am your northern star. As long as you are here, my world has a center. Do not let the ghosts of a dead man steal your peace." He stepped back to prepare for the day, the domestic gentleness beginning to sharpen into professional lethality. He donned a double-breasted charcoal suit, the fabric perfectly tailored to hide the weapons he carried and the ink that marked his rank. as he draped a long wool overcoat over his shoulders, sleeves hanging empty in the traditional style of a high-ranking gangbae. The transformation was complete. He was no longer just her husband. He was the king of Seoul's underbelly. "I have a meeting in Mapo. Take the security team to the mall. Buy something that makes you feel like the queen you are." Amina watched him go, the scent of expensive tobacco and sandalwood lingering in the air. She felt the weight of the dragon's crest ring in her pocket, a symbol of a life she was still learning to inhabit. She believed him when he said the ghosts were dead, but as she prepared to leave for the Lotte luxury mall, she had no idea that one of those ghosts was already waiting in the lobby, ready to test the strength of the dragon's protection. Derek Collins smoothed the front of his tailored black slim-fit suit, checking his reflection in the tinted glass of a high-end storefront. To the casual observer, he looked like a rising star in the international corporate world, but the bulge of the encrypted tablet in his inner pocket told a different story. He was in Seoul as a high-stakes enforcer for a global venture capital firm, sent to ensure that local obstacles were cleared before a massive acquisition. In his world, precision was everything. He carried himself with the athletic grace of a man who spent as much time in the gym as he did in boardrooms, his short-cropped hair and groomed beard maintained with the same clinical perfection he applied to his contracts. He hated the humidity of the city, but he loved the power it afforded him. Walking through the Lotte luxury mall, he felt like a predator in a gilded cage. He relished the way the local staff bowed as he passed, intimidated by his height and the unmistakable aura of corporate muscle that radiated from his cold, detached expression. He was a man who moved pieces on a chessboard, someone who had long ago traded his conscience for a black silk tie and a six-figure expense account. To Derek, people were either assets or liabilities, and he had made a career out of liquidating the latter without a second thought. His mind was focused on the technicalities of his upcoming meeting until a flash of familiar movement near a designer boutique caught his eye. He stopped mid-stride, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a phantom of a past he had worked hard to bury beneath layers of luxury. But as the crowd parted, he saw her clearly. Amina. His lip curled into a reflexive sneer of pure contempt. Even after 3 years, the sight of her triggered a sense of irritation. He remembered her exactly as he had left her, pathetic, weeping and desperate. In his mind, she was still the girl who had clung to his knees in that rain-slicked driveway, begging him for the rent money he had already gambled away. She was the woman who cried about a future and a family, when all he had seen was an anchor dragging him down into the depths of a mediocre life. He had discarded her like a piece of faulty equipment, taking every cent of her savings as a severance package for the time he'd wasted on her. He watched her for a moment, noted her professional black and white striped shirt and the way her hair was pulled back into a tight, sensible bun. She was carrying herself with a strange, quiet dignity that offended his very soul. She looked stable. She looked like she belonged in this temple of excess. The audacity of it burned in his throat. In Derek's world, people like Amina didn't get second chances. They stayed in the gutter where he had placed them. He assumed she was likely a glorified clerk or a personal shopper for someone actually important, playing dress-up in a world she couldn't afford. A calculated cruelty began to simmer in his chest. He didn't just want to ignore her, he wanted to remind her of her place. He wanted to see that mask of stability shatter and watch the bottom feeder recoil in the presence of the man who had broken her once before. He adjusted his silk tie, his expression hardening into a mask of professional malice. He began to walk toward her, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble, a predator moving in for a kill he considered long overdue. Derek Collins was about to remind Amina Johnson that no matter how much she tried to hide it, she would always be the girl who owed him her life.
The air in the Lotte luxury mall felt thinner as Derek closed the distance, his predatory stride eating up the polished marble. Amina was standing near a display of crystal-encrusted clutches, her eyes scanning a list on her phone, oblivious to the storm approaching from her periphery. She looked composed, her black and white striped shirt tucked perfectly into tailored trousers, but as Derek's shadow fell over her, that composure didn't just slip, it vanished. She turned, and for a second, the 3 years of healing were stripped away, leaving her as raw and terrified as the day he had locked her out of their shared life. Still playing dress-up, I see? Derek's voice drawled, slicing through the ambient hum of the mall's Christmas music. He stopped just inches from her personal space, his athletic frame towering over her, his groomed beard twisting into a smirk of pure malice. I have to admit, the professional clerk look almost suits you. Who are you folding clothes for these days, Amina? Or are you just a glorified personal shopper carrying bags for women who actually have a right to be here? Amina's breath hitched, her right hand instinctively flying to the stability of the display counter. Derek, she whispered, the name tasting like ash. What are you doing here? I'm working. Something you wouldn't understand unless it involves begging for scraps, he replied, his eyes roaming over her with clinical judgment. He reached out, his fingers flicking the fabric of her sleeve with a sneer. Cheap cotton. You always did try too hard to look like you weren't starving. Tell me, do they let the help use the front entrance now, or did you sneak in through the loading docks? Amina felt the familiar cold weight of trauma settle in her stomach. She wanted to tell him about the penthouse, about the man who worshipped the ground she walked on, and about the black card in her purse that could buy the very floor Derek was standing on. But her throat was a desert. The power imbalance Derek had cultivated for years was a physical force, pinning her against the glass. I don't want any trouble, Derek. Just let me go. Let you go? Derek laughed, a harsh metallic sound. You were always so dramatic, always the victim, crying about a baby that was nothing but a burden, crying about money you weren't smart enough to keep. He stepped closer, his athletic build tensing. The calculated detachment in his eyes shifted into something sharper, a need to re-establish the hierarchy he felt she was defying just by standing tall. You are staring at me like you think we're equals now. You need a reminder of where you belong. It happened with the professional precision of a man used to clearing obstacles. As Amina moved to sidestep him, Derek balanced on one leg and delivered a forceful, calculated kick to her side. The impact sent her sprawling across the marble, her body crashing into a designer display stand. Glass ornaments shattered like falling stars around her, and the sharp edge of a metal shelf slit through her sleeve, splitting the skin of her elbow. Amina lay on the floor, gasping for air, her left arm tucked defensively against her torso. The mall went into a stunned, horrific silence. Derek stood over her, adjusting his silk tie with a cold, bored expression, as if he had simply swatted a fly. He had no idea that the silent alarm on Amina's wrist had already pulsed a signal to a man who lived for vengeance. He had exactly 5 minutes left of being the predator. He just didn't know the king was already on his way. The golden atmosphere of the Lodi luxury mall curdled into a suffocating, heavy silence that began at the VIP entrance and swept through the atrium like a killing frost. It wasn't the panicked silence of a sudden disaster, but the reverent, terrified stillness that accompanies the arrival of an apex predator. Shoppers froze mid-gesture, and the security guards, who had been tentatively stepping toward the commotion, suddenly snapped their heels together, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The ambient Christmas carol seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of oxblood leather shoes against the marble. Derek Collins, still standing over Amina with a smirk of corporate superiority, felt the temperature drop before he saw the cause. He turned, expecting more mall security he could intimidate with his credentials, but the sneer died on his lips. Moving through the center of the mall was a silhouette that seemed to swallow the light. Kang Min-jae didn't rush. He moved with the weary, dangerous boredom of a man who had already decided the fate of everyone in the room. He wore a double-breasted navy suit that fit his rugged frame like armor, but it was the long charcoal wool overcoat draped over his shoulders, sleeves hanging empty and swinging with a spectral brace, that made him look twice his actual size. Behind him, 6 men in identical black suits followed in a phalanx, their faces masks of stone. But Min-jae was the only one who mattered. As he approached the shattered display, the tops of the Irezumi tattoos crawling up his neck were visible, the ink of a dragon's tail disappearing into his jawline. He didn't look at Derek. He didn't look at the crowd of onlookers holding up their phones to record. His dark eyes were fixed solely on the woman trembling amidst the shards of broken glass.
When he reached Amina, the shadow of soul underwent a transformation that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He slowed his pace to a crawl, the lethal hardness in his gaze softening into a devastating, focused tenderness. He ignored the blood on her elbow and the glass on the floor, crouching beside her with a grace that suggested he had all the time in the world. With a single fluid motion, he caught his wool overcoat before it could slide off his shoulders and draped it over Amina's shaking frame. The heavy fabric, still warm from his body and smelling of sandalwood and expensive tobacco, acted as a shield, instantly hiding her torn sleeve and her vulnerability from the prying lenses of the onlookers. "I told you the doors only lock to keep the world out, Amina," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that acted as an anchor for her spiraling thoughts. He reached out, his heavy gold signet ring brushing against her cheek as he tucked a loose strand of hair back into her bun. "I am here now. The world is gone." He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she were made of the finest porcelain. Only then did he turn his head toward Derek. He didn't shout, he didn't even scowl. He simply looked at the man who had delivered the kick with a look of exhausted clinical curiosity, the way a scientist looks at a specimen it is about to dissect. Derek, the corporate muscle who had felt untouchable only moments ago, found that his legs would not move. The sheer weight of Min Jae's presence pinned him to the spot. The king had arrived to reclaim his northern star, and the mall had become his court.
The silence inside the private security lounge was a different kind of heavy than the vacuum of the mall outside. Here, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the low, dangerous hum of Min Jae's suppressed fury. He sat on the edge of a leather chair, his charcoal overcoat discarded to reveal the white silk of his shirt sleeves rolled back, exposing the intricate dark ink of tigers and lotus flowers that wound tightly around his forearms. He held Amina's hand with a gentleness that bordered on the divine, his thumb tracing the gold band of her wedding ring as a medical assistant finished bandaging her elbow. Amina looked at the way his gold signet ring caught the dim light. She felt the warmth of his skin, yet her mind was 3 years away, trapped in a cold, humid basement apartment where the radiator had stopped clanking weeks before the end. "He didn't just kick me today, Min Jae," she began, her voice a thin wire that threatened to snap. "He's been kicking me for years. He just finally used his feet." Min Jae didn't move. He didn't blink. He became a statue of lethal intent, his dark eyes fixed on her face, absorbing her pain as if it were a physical substance. "Tell me everything," he murmured, the vibration of his voice grounding her. "The ghosts cannot stay in the dark anymore." Amina swallowed against a lump in her throat, the memory of a nursery that never saw a child flooding her vision. "I thought we were a team. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices, waiting tables, tutoring while he networked. I saved every won, every cent for the baby. I had the crib picked out. I had bought a set of yellow onesies because I didn't care if it was a boy or a girl. I just wanted them to be warm." She closed her eyes, and for a moment the antiseptic smell of the lounge became the smell of the rain-slicked driveway where her life had ended. "I came home from a double shift, 4 months pregnant and exhausted, and the apartment was empty. Not just Derek, everything was gone. He had drained the joint account, money my mother had left me, money I'd scrubbed floors for. He'd even taken the change jar. He left a note saying I was an anchor and he needed to sail." Her hands spasmed in Min Jae's grip. "I was evicted 2 days later. I lived in my car for 3 weeks, trying to eat enough on $17 to keep the baby alive. But the stress, the hunger, I woke up one morning and the back seat was covered in blood. I lost my baby in a charity ward, while the nurses looked at me like I was just another statistic. I was alone, Min Jae. I was so alone that I forgot what my own name sounded like." The atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the presence of a predator who had found the scent of the man who had dared to wound his heart. Min Jae's jaw set so hard the scar along his jawline turned a stark, jagged white. He didn't shout. He didn't throw the furniture. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath hitching in a way that terrified her more than his silence. "You were never a statistic," he whispered, his voice thick with a promise of absolute
absolute destruction. You were a queen waiting for her crown, and he stole the throne from a child. He pulled back, his eyes now obsidian pools of cold, calculated execution. He reached for his phone, his heavy gold ring glinting as he dialed a single number. He didn't just steal your money, Amina. He stole a life, and in my world, that is a debt that can only be paid in total, crushing ruin.
The White Room was a clinical, windowless void tucked beneath the mall's sub-basement levels, a place where the vibrant pulse of Seoul's commerce was replaced by the low, electric hum of servers and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Derek Collins sat bolted to a simple metal chair, the tailored perfection of his black slim-fit suit now creased and damp with a cold sweat that no amount of corporate training could suppress. Across from him, Kang Min-jae sat behind a minimalist desk, his charcoal overcoat draped over the back of the chair like a discarded skin. The high-ranking boss didn't look angry. He looked weary, the way a lion might look at an insect that had bothered his mate. Min-jae didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he slowly rotated the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger, the dragon's crest catching the harsh fluorescent light. On the desk sat a high-end laptop, its screen glowing with a series of rapidly scrolling lines of data. "You consider yourself an enforcer of precision, Derek," Min-jae began, his voice a lethal low-frequency vibration. "You believe that your pedigree and your suit make you a man of consequence. But in my world, consequence is not something you wear, it is something you earn." Min-jae tapped a single key. A high-resolution image of Derek's encrypted corporate tablet appeared on a secondary monitor on the wall. "This morning, you were worth $4 million in vested stock, a six-figure salary, and a reputation for being corporate muscle. You thought you were clearing obstacles for your firm." Min-jae's expression remained carved from stone as his finger hovered over the trackpad. "Now look at the screen." Derek's breath hitched as a series of red bars began to swallow the blue data. "What are you doing? You can't just access." "I own the wires you use to communicate, the banks that hold your breath, and the men who signed your contract," Min-jae said, his tone as flat as a dial tone. "As of 30 seconds ago, your firm received an anonymous package. It contains the forensic data of the accounts you drained 3 years ago, the falsified expense reports from your current project, and a detailed list of the rival entities you've been selling information to behind your employer's back." On the wall monitor, a notification popped up. A formal termination notice from Derek's venture capital firm, followed immediately by a freeze order on his personal assets. Derek watched, trembling as the digital counter representing his net worth plummeted toward zero. The athletic confidence that had defined his posture at the mall vanished, replaced by a hollow, frantic gasping. "The money you stole from Amina has been returned to her with 500% interest, pulled directly from your offshore holdings before the freeze was finalized," Min-jae said, finally looking Derek in the eye. The boss slowly stood up, the tops of his lotus tattoos visible above his collar. He didn't move to strike him. The violence was already done. He leaned over the desk, his presence so massive it seemed to suck the oxygen from the small room. "By the time the police realize I've canceled the warrant for your arrest, you will be a ghost. No firm will hire you. No bank will lend to you. Your father has already been notified of your professional failures. You are no longer an enforcer, Derek. You are exactly what you tried to make my wife, a liability with nothing to his name." Min-jae closed the laptop with a soft, final click. "In 5 minutes, my men will dump you in an alley. You will have a cheap phone with no service and $17 in your pocket. I suggest you spend it wisely. It is the last bit of mercy you will ever receive from this city." By the time the sun began to dip behind the glass spires of the city, the digital landscape of Seoul had undergone a seismic shift. In the age of instant viral justice, a narrative can be rewritten in the time it takes to refresh a feed, and Min-jae's media assets worked with the surgical efficiency of a cartel hit. The high-resolution security footage from the Lotte luxury mall didn't just leak, it exploded onto every major news platform and social media thread under the trending tag, The Lotte Shadow. However, the footage people saw was not a random scuffle. It had been meticulously edited to emphasize the stark, jarring contrast between a refined, dignified woman and a man who had clearly lost his grip on reality. The video opened with Amina standing in the boutique, her posture regal and her expression focused, the picture of a professional woman of high standing. Then the frame shifted to Derek. In the high-definition playback, his tailored black slim-fit suit didn't look like power. It looked like a desperate costume for a man unraveling. The calculated kick he delivered was slowed down, highlighting the raw, cowardly violence of the act. But the true genius of the leak was the metadata attached to it. Every major outlet received a verified tip-off identifying Derek not as a high-powered executive, but as a disgraced corporate liability who had been caught in a web of embezzlement and was currently suffering a violent psychological breakdown. Amina watched the screen of her tablet in the back seat of the motorcade, her heart hammering against her ribs. The headlines were a blur of vindication. International corporate enforcer exposed. Collins' violent meltdown at Lotte Mall, screamed one. Another focused on her. The dignity of the Phoenix, unknown global executive Amina Johnson maintains grace under brutal assault. The public wasn't just sympathetic, they were obsessed. They saw the way she had looked up from the floor with wide, shocked eyes, not with the weakness of a victim, but with the bewildered grace of a queen who couldn't believe a commoner had dared to touch her. As the comment section swelled into the millions, the narrative solidified. Derek was being branded as the ultimate toxic male, a fraud whose athletic frame and groomed beard were merely a mask for a pathological bully. Conversely, Amina's background, scrubbed of her homeless days and replaced with a private international success story, made her the new icon of resilience. People began to post stills of the moment Min Jae's charcoal wool overcoat settled over her shoulders, the empty sleeves waving like the wings of a protective dark angel. They didn't know who the man was, but they knew what he represented, a power so absolute it didn't need to shout to be felt. Min Jae sat beside her, his rugged face illuminated by the passing streetlights. He watched her watch the world change its mind about her. He reached out, his heavy gold signet ring catching a flash of neon red as he gently closed the tablet's cover. "The court of public opinion has reached its verdict, Amina," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rasp. "To them, he is a ghost, and you are a monument. He can never take your name in his mouth again without the world remembering him as a coward." Amina leaned her head back against the buttery leather of the seat, a long, shaky breath finally leaving her lungs. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding. The public unmasking had stripped Derek of his only weapon, his perceived importance. He was no longer the man who had stolen her future. He was a viral warning, a disgraced footnote in a story he no longer controlled. Amina looked at Min Jae, whose eyes held a weary but satisfied glint. The shadow of Seoul had turned the entire city into a shield for his northern star, and the light was finally beginning to blind their enemies.
The rainy season in Seoul had arrived with a vengeance, turning the neon-soaked streets into a blurred watercolor of gray and obsidian. In a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway 3 blocks from the luxury district, a heavy black sedan skidded to a halt. The rear door opened just wide enough for the corporate muscle formerly known as Derek Collins to be shoved out into the muck. He hit the wet pavement with a sickening thud, his tailored slim-fit suit now a ruined, sodden rag. As he scrambled to find his footing, a single crumpled bill and a few coins fluttered down onto his chest like a mocking benediction. Derek looked down at the money with trembling hands. It was exactly $17. His athletic frame, once a source of predatory pride, now felt hollow and fragile. He looked up just in time to see the sedan's taillights vanish, replaced by the imposing silhouette of a secondary motorcade, pulling slowly to the curb at the mouth of the alley. The lead vehicle, a matte black armored SUV, hummed with the quiet power of a dormant volcano. Behind its tinted bulletproof glass, Amina sat in the plush silence of the back seat. The heavy charcoal wool overcoat Min Jae had draped over her at the mall was still settled around her shoulders, its warmth a physical barrier against the cold reality Derek now inhabited. Through the darkened window, Amina watched the man who had once been the architect of her despair. He looked small. Without the high-end office, the expense accounts, and the borrowed status of his firm, Derek Collins was nothing more than a terrified man clutching $17 in a rainstorm.
She remembered the morning she had sat in her rusted car, staring at that exact amount, feeling the life inside her fade because she couldn't afford to keep it. She had thought that amount was a death sentence. Now, seeing it in Derek's hand, she realized it was simply a mirror. Beside her, Min Jae remained a statue of rugged, tattooed lethalness. He didn't look at the alley. His focus was entirely on Amina, his dark eyes searching her face for any trace of the old pain. He reached out, his heavy gold signet ring brushing against her hand as he interlaced their fingers. The weight of his hand was a promise that the cycle of poverty and violence had been permanently broken. "Do you want to speak to him?" Min Jae asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely disturbed the silence of the cabin. Amina shook her head slowly. She realized she had nothing left to say. To speak to him would be to acknowledge that he still existed in her world. But as she watched Derek struggle to stand, his polished shoes slipping in the grime, she felt a profound sense of detachment. The ghost that had haunted her for 3 years had finally lost its voice. The trauma hadn't vanished, but the weight of it, the crushing, suffocating gravity of Derek's influence, had finally lifted. "No," Amina whispered, her voice steady and clear. "He's just a stranger now." Min Jae nodded to the driver. The motorcade began to move, the tires of the armored vehicle splashing through the puddles, spraying a fine mist over the man in the alley. Derek shouted something, a desperate plea for mercy or recognition, but the sound was swallowed by the rain and the hum of the engine. Amina didn't look back. She watched the reflection of the city's gold and neon lights dance across the window, her hand gripped tightly in Min Jae's. The weight of gold wasn't just in the jewelry they wore or the penthouse they shared. It was in the absolute freedom to leave the past in the mud where it belonged. The heavy glass doors of the newly renovated facility in the heart of the Mapo district stood as a testament to a life reclaimed. Etched in frosted crystal above the entrance were the words, "Amina's Light," a beacon of hope for women who had navigated the same treacherous shadows Amina had once inhabited. The building, a sleek fusion of modern stone and warm wood, didn't look like a shelter, it looked like a sanctuary of power. On this morning, the air was crisp, and the scent of celebratory lilies mingled with the cold, clean breeze of a Seoul winter. Amina stood at the top of the stairs, her reflection in the glass a far cry from the woman who had recoiled on the mall floor only months ago. She wore a sharp, custom-tailored emerald green power suit that complemented her deep complexion, the structured shoulders giving her a silhouette of unshakable authority. Her hair was no longer pulled back in a defensive bun. It cascaded in soft, voluminous waves, and around her neck hung a delicate gold chain with a phoenix pendant, its eyes made of tiny burning rubies. Beside her, Kang Min Jae was a pillar of rugged, silent support. He wore a double-breasted navy suit, his long wool overcoat draped over his shoulders in his signature style. As he checked his gold watch, the tops of the Irizumi dragons on his neck were visible, signaling to every politician and journalist in the crowd that this center was under the personal protection of the city's underground king. "Are you ready?" Min Jae murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that only she could hear. He reached out, his heavy gold signet ring catching the sunlight as he briefly squeezed her hand. There was no weariness in his eyes today, only a terrifyingly soft pride. Amina nodded, stepping toward the podium. The cameras flashed, a rhythmic staccato of light that she no longer feared. She looked out at the faces of the first 10 residents, women who had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ghosts of men like Derek in their heads. "For a long time, I believed that my value was something others could take from me," Amina began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying through the quiet street. "I believed that being left with nothing meant that I was nothing. But I stand here today to tell you that the dark doesn't win unless you stop looking for the light." She spoke of the second chance grant, a funding by the very money Min Jae had clawed back from Derek's accounts, now repurposed to provide housing, legal aid, and professional training. As she spoke, she didn't look like a survivor of a tragedy. She looked like the architect of a new world. She felt the weight of her past, but it no longer felt like a stone pulling her under. It felt like the foundation upon which she had built this fortress. When she took the ceremonial scissors to cut the ribbon, Min-jae placed his hand over hers. Together, they sliced through the silk, a clean, final cut that echoed the way they had severed her ties to Derek. The crowd erupted in applause, but Amina only had eyes for the rugged man beside her. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her temple that was caught by a dozen cameras, a public vow of a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. Derek Collins was a name the city had already forgotten, a ghost rotting in the mud of his own making. But Amina Johnson was a name that would now be spoken with reverence. As she led the first woman through the doors, Amina finally realized that she hadn't just been saved by a king. She had discovered the queen that had been waiting inside her all along.
6 months later, the Mapo district was blanketed in a pristine layer of snow, but the warmth inside the penthouse remained absolute. Amina stood by the window, her hand resting on the slight new curve of her stomach, a secret she and Min-jae had only whispered to each other the night before. This time, there was no fear, no hunger, and no shadow. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was a restricted alert from Min-jae's security detail, a routine update she now monitored with a calm, practiced eye. The report featured a grainy photo taken in a desolate corner of a neighboring province. In it, a man with a hollowed face and a matted, unkempt beard was seen scavenging through a dumpster outside a low-end convenience store. Derek was unrecognizable, his athletic frame withered, wearing a threadbare jacket that offered no protection against the Siberian winds. Amina looked at the photo for a long second. She waited for a spark of anger or a flicker of satisfaction, but she found only the cold, sterile distance of a closed book. She didn't even bother to zoom in. With a flick of her thumb, she deleted the file, consigning the image to digital oblivion. Amina. Min-jae's voice was like a low cello note, vibrating through the room. He stepped out of his office, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the intricate Irezumi dragon that guarded his heart. He didn't ask what she was looking at. He didn't need to. He saw the peace in her eyes and the way she stood, balanced, powerful, and whole. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, his heavy gold signet ring cool against her skin as he cupped her face. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in their silent ritual of devotion. "The past is a graveyard, my northern star," he whispered, his eyes dark with an infinite protective love. "And we do not live among the dead." Amina smiled, pressing her hand over his. Outside, the city of Seoul glittered like a sea of diamonds, a kingdom they had conquered not through fear, but through the resilience of a love that had risen from the ashes. The dragon and the phoenix were no longer just survivors. They were the architects of a legacy that would never be broken again.